Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And as I said to at least one other person earlier, that professor friend of mine said, don't ever teach anything you don't love. And I love talking about humanitarian law and humanitarian systems. And I am so grateful to be with you here at the University of Mississippi. And I want you to know that we are in a very, what we call in philosophy or theology, a kairos moment. Anybody ever heard that word before, a kairos moment? It means it's maybe a pivot point in history, maybe a hinge event time, when people who are concerned have an opportunity for choice that we don't get almost every day. And so when I look at you, I think this is an opportunity to reason together, to think together about what might happen with your career choice. Now, I assume since you're seniors and graduate students that you really are serious about journalism. Are most of you heading for journalistic careers? Can I see your hands? Not most of you. Some of you are heading for journalistic careers. Why are the rest of you taking journalism classes? Because it was here, and you love the professor, right?
It's required for the marketing degree.
Oh, that's it. Marketing. You're in marketing. How many are going to be in marketing careers? All right. That explains it, as one of the famous splainers used to be called. I think that it's important for people who are interested in marketing to understand the ethical issues of marketing. I was in an organization for 25 years that had to balance advocacy for poor and suffering people with what was going to offend the people who were paying for the organization, or not offend the people who were paying for the organization. It's a tough line to keep. And anybody who really cares about the issues in the world today is going to find him or herself faced with some very difficult decisions about how far we go in telling people what we see. And humanitarianism is that part of society that takes the prophetic utterances of all of our religious literature seriously about the poor and the oppressed, the orphans, the imprisoned, etc. And so there are humanitarian laws that give us understanding of how to proceed in that regard. There are also constitutional laws in our Constitution and in our amendments. And I'm sure one of the things you've had to discuss or got to discuss in your learnings is the First Amendment of the Constitution that requires us to not establish one another. Like religion can't establish government, government can't establish religion. There's a creative barrier so that we who have a spiritual base for what we're doing, we can't embed ourselves with government or politics, but we can engage. And in fact, the First Amendment gives us not only the right, but the responsibility to really be people who stand up for people who are suffering. It's our responsibility. It's made possible by the way the laws are written in our country. So that's a law that we all live with in terms of humanitarian law that everybody, sometimes, not everybody, but a lot of people take for granted, and we shouldn't. And in fact, it's a kairos moment because these issues are being debated in Washington, in the UN, in the international fora, where some of you will one day work. And I want to make the suggestion right at the beginning, and it's one of the things that I base this lecture on, that in journalism and in marketing, you may very well end up being people who will reveal things with real facts about the needs of a community or the needs of the world. And it, as some of the people that were here earlier saw, the humanitarian rainbow, where everybody takes upon themselves a color, like the Red Cross red, humanitarian operations orange, environmentalists green. We do it as a matter of course in our conversations during these days, but we begin to understand when we talk about it that way that in fact we're not really having social justice impact unless all the colors of the rainbow are involved. All the colors, including journalism, including law, including economics. Otherwise, the light goes dim. The light is gray. White isn't white. So I'm challenging us today to think creatively about how to apply the Geneva Conventions. We won't have time to talk about the sphere principles, but it's something to write down and look up when you have time, because it has to do with continuing learning about humanitarian issues and how to apply things. Let me tell you first of all how I personally got involved in sort of heavy-duty humanitarian operations. I was working in the Senate. I was a legislative director to the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. That time his name was Mark Hatfield. He was a very activist, social justice Christian. He was well known for trying, along with Ted Kennedy, to put a nuclear freeze on the development of nuclear weapons. He was one of the senators that attempted, lost by only one vote, to cut off funding for the Vietnam War. He was commander of a landing craft that went into Hiroshima 36 hours after the bombing of Hiroshima to do an assessment for the military. And he saw the results of atomic weaponry. And so he lived his whole life as a person advocating for not only the reduction, but the abolishing of nuclear weapons. The nuclear weapon treaty we have today, where we reduced our nuclear warheads, is partly because Mark Hatfield stood up with other progressive senators and said, enough already. So I was sitting at my desk waiting for a very important appointment 15 minutes later with one of the people that was working on this issue. And I had written some creative legislation for Africa and some of our sanctions that were put on countries like Zimbabwe that were violating human rights. And suddenly, I got a call from the front office saying, there's a gentleman here who says he doesn't have an appointment, but he would like a briefing on African issues that the Senate is addressing. So I said, please bring him back, and they brought him back to my office, and he was a little tiny man with this infectious smile, and he was a South African who was visiting, having just finished a study in England, and I said, I'm sorry, sir, I'm embarrassed, actually, that I only have 15 minutes because I have this very important appointment. And he didn't blink. He said, that's all right, let's just sit for a minute. So an hour and a half later, when Desmond Tutu left, it was a launch for me into a whole new understanding of things in Africa. And the senator had a lunch for him the next day. He then invited us to come on a congressional delegation to South Africa. And while we were there on the president's backup plane, Air Force Two, he said to me, please bring your family back. I'd like to host you here and make sure you see what's happening in apartheid South Africa. And one thing led to another, and I've been back every year since. This is the first winter in 9 years that I haven't spent in South Africa, because my daughter, who married a South African, is the mother of our 4 South African grandsons. has now become an Episcopal priest, and she's teaching gender ethics at Exeter University in England. And Desmond Tutu's daughter's staying at our house while we're here in Mississippi this week. So these things change our lives when you begin to be challenged by the fact that maybe we don't understand everything we need to know about what's happening in the wider world in terms of international law. I learned more than I could have ever learned in 2 degrees in graduate school about what humanitarian law means in apartheid and then post-apartheid South Africa. So I'm trusting that the same thing will be true with you. It'll be true with you whether you're in journalism or politics or marketing or whatever. You'll have a chance to apply these things. The current problem is not if there will be a future for humanitarian action, but rather how humanitarian action is being enacted in the future. Hugo Slim is an important person writing about humanitarian issues. Please write his name down, and you may want to Google him. There's so many things that humanitarian law touches. So the code of conduct that we live with, and this is true in journalism and in marketing, the principal commitments for International Red Cross and the Red Crescent movements, and the NGOs in disaster relief. That's where it all comes to a head. When we are charged with taking care of 3 million refugees, or in the wider world, 60 million refugees, more refugees than at any time since the Second World War. That's the code of conduct. Don't try and read it off that sheet because I'm going to give it to you one by one. But the humanitarian imperative comes first. Do no harm. It's the same thing as the doctor's pledge. We have our own Hippocratic oath. And there's lots of opportunity to do harm as well as good when you're doing humanitarian work. Aid is given regardless of the race, creed, or nationality of the recipients and without adverse distinction of any kind. Can you imagine doing something in a crisis zone where you don't practice discretion? It is really tough. Really tough. No adverse distinction of any kind. Aid priorities are calculated on the basis of need only. Not what political party a group belongs to, not what color they are, not what nationality they are. If they need aid under the humanitarian law, we have to provide it. Aid will not be used to further a political or a religious standpoint. I had a conversation today with the director of another program here on campus, and he said he'd done an interview for his school on campus, and the lady said, well, I want to get into humanitarian work and international work so I can convert people in Spain to Christianity. Hello? Spain's been a Christian country for years and years in the first place, but secondly, you don't use bread to convert people to your point of view. We found out through hard practice over many years that that kind of conversion is not a very deep conversion. We shall endeavor not to act as instruments of government foreign policy. That's a tough one, because there are some people that join international agencies. Probably the UN would be a best example, or maybe the Red Cross, where they really are there to whisper in somebody's ear that President this or President that or Prime Minister this or Prime Minister that really would like us to do it this way. That is not to be what influences us. We can do it indirectly. We can say, this is wheat that's been given by the United States of America. We shall respect culture and custom. When an American faith-based agency works in a Muslim country, we are careful to not use Christian language. When we're in a Christian country, we try very hard to interpret the language of other religions. That's really one that is maybe most challenging for some of our people. Ways shall be found to involve program beneficiaries, in the management of relief aid. We don't hire just foreigners and bring them in to Somalia. We don't only hire people from other African countries to take them in to Sudan. We do our very best to do as much hiring as we can from the local population. For one thing, they need jobs, and a lot of them are better qualified, particularly in language and custom, than a lot of the people we bring from the United States or from the European countries. Relief aid must strive to reduce future vulnerabilities to disaster as well as meeting basic needs. One of the biggest crises that I worked on before the Middle East situation was the famous Ethiopian Sudan famine of the mid-'80s. It was a huge marketing challenge, for one thing. I hired a man named Mohammed Amin to fly into the worst of the areas and photograph what was happening. Some of the most famous photographs in history of relief operations came from Mohammed Amin. He took great risks to get the word out. Perfect illustration of a very principled journalist who helped very principled marketers. And what we did in Ethiopia, this is almost unbelievable to people, was discovered that there was water just a foot or 18 inches under the surface of the drought area. If those people had known and been helped to do proper well digging and irrigating and so on, it wouldn't have had to have been the terrible tragedy where 1 million people died. So what we did after everybody was fed, everybody was resettled, everybody got back to their home villages, was we made, not just my organization, World Vision, but the Red Cross, the UN agencies, that valley and Sokia Valley in Ethiopia became a garden spot. It became a place where people now go when there's shortage of water in other places. So we have to figure out how to mitigate the future tragedies. That's Red Cross principles. We hold ourselves accountable to both those we seek to assist and those from whom we accept resources. So it's sometimes really hard to do the accountability that's required in the kind of material that's delivered and the way the programming is done so the distribution is equitable. In our information, publicity, here's the marketing part, and advertising activities, we shall recognize disaster victims as dignified human beings, not hopeless objects. You've seen some photographs that maybe haven't been approved by the proper authorities that show people as they show them in very undignified fashion. That would be nakedness. That would mean children who are really suffering without a parent nearby. That would be taking pictures of children without the permission of the parents or the responsible parties. Many, many things you have to keep in mind when you're trying to market and not use manipulative methods. The basic rules of international law in armed conflict is very important. Has anybody ever studied that separately? Does anybody in the room know about that from either academic work or personal involvement? This may be one of the most important things I'll say to you today. They're basic rules of humanitarian law in armed conflicts. Tough stuff, really tough stuff. A person who's not involved, hors de combat, a person who's not involved in combat, and those who do not take a direct part in the hostilities are entitled to respect for their lives and their moral and physical integrity. They shall in all circumstances be protected and treated humanely without any adverse distinction. I've been on the ground in places like Gaza when airplanes shoot missiles into apartment buildings. Even if a party at war thinks there's a criminal or an adversary or a person that would do harm to them, like a person would have a surface-to-air missile firer for that airplane that's running the attack, even if they know there's a person there in an apartment building or a hospital, they are forbidden under international law to put civilians at risk. Yes?
It's equivalent to like our LOAC, I'm assuming,
It's in your manual. It's in the soldier's manual. Thank you very much. Did you all understand that? The American Army puts these rules into their combat handbook. Thank God they do. There other countries don't have that. In fact, when my wife and I lived in the Middle East, we found soldiers had never even heard of this. And so we carried with us these rules in our pockets. And the other NGOs did the same. They shall in all circumstances be protected and treated humanely without any adverse distinction. It is forbidden to kill or injure an enemy who surrenders or is to combat. You've seen in the news in the last 6 months people who have been disarmed in the Middle East, maybe had a kitchen knife or something, and they're lying even injured on the ground, and they're executed. That's against international humanitarian law, and the soldier that did it is being prosecuted. The wounded and sick shall be collected and cared for by the party to the conflict which has them in its power. By the way, this is being filmed, so take notes, especially about things that really trigger in your mind something you want to pursue, but you will be able to get it on film too. So the wounded and sick shall be collected and cared for by the party to the conflict which has them in its power. This could be civilians or soldiers who are now under the protection of the enemy force. This is one that we really have to watch carefully when we're in the field. Protection also covers medical personnel, establishments, transports, and equipment. Many, many times in the last several years, we've seen ambulances fired on. It is so tragic because often they are carrying people who would survive if they got help, and the medical personnel are killed too. The emblem of the Red Cross or the Red Crescent is the sign of such protection and must be respected. That's why all the ambulances and medical personnel that we have or our party with the Red Cross have the Red Crescent or the Red Cross on the roof too. Captured combatants and civilians under the authority of an adverse party are entitled to respect for their lives. This is a restating of 2. Dignity, personal rights, and convictions. They shall be protected against all acts of violence and reprisals. They shall have the right to correspond with, misspelling, their families and to receive relief. Everyone shall be entitled, number 5, to benefit from fundamental judicial guarantees. Now, we've seen that even in this country in the last 2 weeks, where judicial parties have stood up to say those people need protection and make sure they're treated with respect and received with the visas they have. Now, that can happen not only at our major airports here, it can happen in checkpoints in a country in the midst of combat. No one shall be subjected to physical or mental torture, corporal punishment, or cruel or degrading treatment. Wherever one country is occupying another country and is taking property and so on, it's a temptation to put those people at risk or to treat them cruelly. So this is a very important Parties to a conflict and members of their armed forces do not have unlimited choice of methods and means of warfare. It is prohibited to employ methods, weapons, or methods of warfare of a nature to cause unnecessary losses or excessive suffering. Again, in the Middle East, I've seen phosphorus-tipped shells that can penetrate big stone buildings, be fired into personal homes, even without the suspicion that there's an enemy inside, just to break down the morale of the people being fired upon. It is such a tragic thing. And when you go into those homes and you see how people have been injured and how phosphorus weaponry that can burn, and even if they get a fragment inside, it continues to burn in their bodies, this is so important to keep in mind. It is prohibited to employ those weapons or methods of warfare of a nature to cause unnecessary losses, excessive suffering. In fact, the United States is forbidden under law to ship those kind of weapons to a place where they might be used on a civilian. Parties to a conflict shall at all times distinguish between the civilian population and the combatants in order to spare the civilian population and property. Neither the civilian population as such nor civilian persons shall be the objects of the attack. Attacks shall be directed solely against military objectives. American military is one of the best in the world in this regard. However, the use of drones has become a very difficult issue. I was in a conversation with the former CIA director, and we were talking about the efficacy of using drones, and he said to me in the hearing of others that he's very, very worried about the use of drones because there's no pilot in a drone that's going to determine if there's it's a civilian car or an enemy car. It's a civilian house or an enemy house. So thank God there are people thinking about that in our government. And then finally, I'm going to show you just a little bit about the development goals. Right after 9/11, the UN released some goals for how to make things better in the world. To not only apply the rules of war, but the prophetic, in all our religious literature, whether it's Christian, Muslim, Jewish, all our prophetic literature says we need to be constantly thinking about the marginalized, the poor, the oppressed, the imprisoned, the injured, the blind. And the Millennium Development Goals were an attempt to keep the promise to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger by reducing half the proportion of people living on less than $1 a day. We were supposed to have this done by 2 years ago, 2015. Reduced by half the proportion of people who suffer from hunger. Goal 2, achieve universal primary education. Because when people are educated, they're less likely to fall into poverty. They're more likely, to, obviously, to be able to earn a living. To ensure that all boys and girls complete a full course of primary schooling. 3, promote gender equality and empower women. That's my daughter's specialty, and it's really interesting to see the research that's being done in terms of gender ethics. Eliminate gender disparity in primary and secondary education, preferably by 2005, and in all levels by 2015. Good luck, right? Reduce child mortality. This is one where there was great progress until the Syrian conflict. Reduced by 2/3 the mortality rate among children under 5. It's been horrific, the number of children that have died, particularly in the Middle East in the last 10 years. Improve maternal health, reduced by 3/4 the maternal mortality ratio. You have no idea, unless you've traveled in Africa, how often a woman dies in childbirth. It's like medieval times. Most women give birth to children without any help except whoever's in the household or a midwife. This one we also made great progress on. Combat HIV and AIDS, malaria, and other diseases. Again, huge progress, with much thanks to the Carter Center and to the Clinton Global Health Initiative, and by George W. Bush's interest in PEPFAR, the program to reduce AIDS. Halt and begin to reverse the spread of HIV and AIDS. That's really been one of the things that we've nearly accomplished. Halt and begin to reverse the incidence of malaria and other major diseases. Again, great progress. Not there completely, but we made progress. Ensure environmental sustainability. This is a tough one. We're falling back severely on this. We were making progress, especially with the international agreements, but we haven't integrated the principles of sustainable development into country policies, like I told you what we did in Ethiopia. It's very hard to then use resources to undertake sustainability after a crisis. Reverse the loss of environmental resources. Reduce by half the proportion of people without sustainable access to safe drinking water. Now this is huge, and this is becoming, as I said to the earlier class, a huge problem in the United States. There's a danger that up to 20 million people in this country by 2020 will not have clean water to drink, much like happened in Flint, Michigan. That's a frightening thing. And it's people like us who are marketers and journalists and humanitarians. We've got to pay attention to this. And part of it is malappropriation of resources. Achieve significant improvement in the lives of at least 100 million slum dwellers by 2020. Some of the water through the pipes in low-cost housing, Section 8 housing, is horrific. It's a big crisis in the Northeast now in public housing because of this, especially in New York and Washington. Develop global partnerships for development. This is something that those of us that lived in Geneva for 9 or 10 years worked hard on, where we got every NGO to have a partner in the UN. World Vision, World Food Program, Médecins Sans Frontières, World Health Organization, etc. And it was wonderful because we actually traveled to countries, did workshops, so that people would know who their first call was in a crisis, or be ready to work together more closely than they had before in a crisis. And to merge our financial systems. At least, and address the least developed countries, special needs. Address the special needs of landlocked and small island developing states. Made progress in that one. Develop a global partnership for development. This is the other part of it. Deal comprehensively with developing countries, debt problems. In cooperation with developing countries, develop a decent, productive work for young people. In cooperation with pharmaceutical companies, again, a marketing issue. Provide access to affordable, essential drugs in developing countries. To allow patents to expire of expensive drugs so they could be produced in South Africa, for instance. Now, we're starting all over. Last year, there was a big assessment of where we were, and these are the ones, I won't go through them like I did the others, but these are the ones that we now are working with. No poverty, zero hunger, good health, clean water, affordable energy, decent work, etc. And that won't happen unless we can help resolve the conflicts that are going on. Because as long as there are conflicts going on, we go backwards. This is something that many of you will work in organizations for that will sign up to these goals. So begin to pick the ones you want to work on. Begin to pick the ones that you're going to be a minority of one or a base camp group that will work on these issues. Because this is where our future lies. This is where less conflict will be made possible. Wherever the goals are kept, wherever they're really participated in by all parties, there's less conflict in struggling for resources. Questions? What are you concerned about? How can we more efficiently, as a group of people who are about to go out into the world to work on these things, how can we become more efficient? What do you want to know from me from my experience about what might be useful? Any questions? Yes?
Are a lot of those goals you have for 2016 also for this new?
Stand up, I can't hear you.
Are a lot of the goals you just have for 2016, do they roll over to this year too?
Yeah, all of them roll over, but with different goalposts. Yeah, because we didn't accomplish any of the first Global Millennium Goals. Made progress, but we've reshaped them now to do it again in this context. Somebody else?
In your career, have you seen more attention or less attention to humanitarian law as a trend?
Oh boy, did y'all hear that? More or less attention to the humanitarian laws. It's a really hard thing because, again, we made progress on distributing so that everybody knew what they were, but we didn't make progress on reducing the conflicts that were putting people into a position where they had to keep those laws. I think we can be somewhat proud about the fact that we did get the word out to more and more people. But prosecutions have lagged, shall we say, for people who have violated severely. And the rapid development of the mechanics of war have made it harder, much harder, to supervise it, to evaluate it. That's really been a heartbreaker, really a heartbreaker. And for those of us that live with some hope about what the future is going to look like for our kids and grandkids, that's what gives me a knot in my stomach. I'm not an optimist, but as I said earlier, I'd live with hope because of the things I saw in South Africa, because of the things I saw in Ireland, because of the things I saw in the Balkans, because of the things that I participated in East Africa. But it's often 2 steps forward, 1 step back, really is. So we need your help. Please, I'm an evangelist. I want you to engage. I want you to be people who take this to heart and apply your deepest convictions to these principles and to the action that you can do. Thanks for the question. Other questions? Yeah.
What is the percentage of help that goes to other countries versus, people who stay here to help with people here?
Oh, I've never looked at that. Maybe that's something you should check out. But America has been phenomenal in the way we've raised money for, sent people to, not only crisis situations, but potentially productive development situations. I can tell you that in the last 6 months, because of the political debate here about what the best ways to go are on foreign assistance and tax revenue and so on, that I haven't seen the mobilizing of cooperation and community activity since the Vietnam War. It's really pretty exciting. I shared earlier that my wife and I are involved in refugee resettlement This is a volunteer thing. I don't do it for pay. We find less expensive housing. We outfit the house with all that a family would need to be comfortable. And we've received in the last 2 months 3 Afghan families in which either the mother or the father had been employees of the United States and their lives are at risk because they associated with Americans. And those people are now safely, one family just the week before the ban, safely and very comfortable, not lavish, but very comfortable housing, little kids that just make your heart sing. And we're all prepared now with a storehouse of furniture to welcome some Syrian families as soon as the government figures out how to handle this refugee debate. There are many, many people already vetted, lined up, have visas, been checked out, and are having a hard time getting into the country. And people are mobilizing. I mean, an illustration was the Women's March 2 weeks ago. That was amazing. That started with one person, with one email communication in Hawaii. And look what happened. Millions of people all over the world gathered to raise the issues. So I'm encouraged on that front. I think sometimes Kairos moments bring new attention and new energy. And a lot of young people, a lot more young people than I've seen involved in a long, long time. Thanks for the question. Somebody else? Yeah.
You talked about portraying people in a dignified way. How do you go about making decisions to tailor messages for the government granting agencies and policy agencies while still maintaining the dignity of the people that you're trying to help? How do you make those decisions?
Well, I'm proud to say, having been a government employee, but not just because of that, I'm proud to say that most of our aid agencies, particularly USAID, but the UN agencies as well, tailor the transmission of goods and services in a way that respects the dignity of people. It's harder when you're living it out on the ground. It's much harder when you're trying to do it the right way on the ground. We're all human, and we make mistakes, and we need community help. We need accountability from one another. That's why the NGOs, and many of them faith-based, Jewish, Islamic, Christian, faith-based agencies, are in constant communication with the government, not just ours, but all the governments of the world, those representatives on the ground. So that, to me, is a bright spot. Not perfect, because people make mistakes, but it's an area where we work really hard to merge the two concerns. Yeah. Somebody else? Yes?
You said our service, like our military service, has their own handbooks about these rules,
Yep, combat handbook.
and you want to help like spread that around the world. But what,
Oh, not we don't spread the handbook around. No. You wouldn't let us do that, right? What we do is we do little brochures with the Geneva Conventions, with the Red Cross principles, and give it to soldiers that have never seen something like this.
how did they react to it whenever they'd never seen it? I mean, like, were they all like accepting of it, or were they like?
I've never had a person reject it or throw it on the ground when I gave it to them. I think they were relieved, actually, because the term we use in the ground, no offense to you young men and women who are carrying arms for our country, but boys with toys in countries, more boys than girls, men in countries that haven't been instructed in the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, the Red Cross principles, are at risk in a crisis situation to overreacting and doing something that they will grieve over. An illustration is, this is really something. My wife and I shared a house in Jerusalem with a progressive Jewish family that we really began to feel like they were our own family. And I think they felt the same about us. They had 3 kids, beautiful children. They were they were Sephardic Jews. They were Jews from the region. They spoke Arabic. They were very sympathetic to people who were being persecuted and spoke out about it. But their kids were required to serve in the military. And while we were with them, while we were living there, 2 Israeli soldiers illegally, irresponsibly, not knowing the rules, whether sent or not sent, we could never figure out because nobody would confess it, went as spies into Ramallah. They were dressed as Arabs, they spoke Arabic, and they were gathering information. They were discovered by the authorities, the Palestinian authorities. They were put in jail to protect them. They were keeping the rules. But Palestinian, they don't have soldiers, they have liberation fighters. One man's liberation fighter is another man's terrorist. Liberation fighters broke into the jail, took those 2 soldiers out, and killed them. We went downstairs right away because we were concerned that maybe, who knew, it was one of the kids we knew. But it wasn't. Thank God. But I offered condolences to this Jewish family, saying, I'm so sorry. This violates all the laws of war from both sides. But you have our condolences. Maybe your children know these young people. And the mother said to me, you know, these young guys were soldiers. They knew the risks. The people we should be offering condolences to are the young people that killed them and their families, because those young guys will never sleep a whole night in their whole lives because of what they've done. That really touched me because the human compassion is not assigned to one group over another. The Palestinian partisans don't have more access to that than the Israeli partisans. And these were people who were reaching across the divide and making friends on the other side. So her heart right away turned to the kids that were still alive. And I was really touched by that. So I think when you're in a zone like that, you're going to face situations throughout Africa, throughout the Middle East, especially in Syria now. It's happening over and over and over again in Syria. One of the things we did in the NGO community then was to establish groups where grieving parents from both sides could meet one another. And when my wife and I take people to the Middle East now to hear both sides, we call it a multi-narrative conversation. We take people there, we have people come to speak to us who are Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arab Christians or Muslims, and share the stories about how in their grief they found each other to support one another. And one time, unbeknownst to us, the people that came to speak to us, the Israeli father had lost his daughter to a bombing by a Palestinian, and it was the father of the Palestinian that was sitting there at the table with him. It didn't return. The Arab man didn't lose his daughter because a Jewish soldier shot her, but there was that kind of interaction. So in these worst situations, people kind of intuitively are applying the laws of war. And that's the sort of thing that we as journalists and marketers and humanitarians have to help foster. That's really the call upon us in these situations. You want to follow up? Okay. Somebody else? We have time for one or two more. Yes?
With our current change in government and the agenda of our new leadership, do you foresee any drastic changes in our international humanitarian efforts, if any at all?
Did you hear that back there? With the change of government now, from one administration to another, from one party to another, do we notice any changes? It's too early to tell, for starters, but the appropriations process transcends a change, an interregnum in government. And thank God again for what's happening in our civil service. Many of the people that manage these programs are not Democrats or Republicans. They're committed civil servants who have a charge to do the things we're talking about. So immediately we won't notice any change. The only way there might be a change is the way the array of international donors, the money is distributed. My hope is that there'll be less money to countries that don't need it because they're thriving economies now. They may not have been when the aid started. They're better protected now. They don't need American resource so much. And that the countries that are the most severe, like Syria, will be, when the war stops and we have to do a humanitarian intervention there, that they'll get more. Same in Africa. There are African countries now that need a lot more aid than they're getting. But that's a good question. I'll keep an eye on it. You too. Keep an eye on it. And stand up if you don't like it. One more? Yeah.
Everywhere you've been in the world, you've been everywhere, Middle East, Africa. What do other countries think of us as Americans?
What other countries what?
What do other countries think of America? How do you see
I think since the Iraq War, our image has diminished a good bit. Sorry to have to say that. I mean, that's my experience. When I started this work in the early 80s, even in countries where we were pushing very hard to dismantle apartheid or whatever, America's image was very, very positive. And my wife and I and our children and our colleagues were pretty much free to go anywhere on both sides of conflicts. But the loss of life, the use of resources, the aftermath of military interventions when there should have probably been more diplomatic intervention has caused people to have doubts about America's intentions. And that's another thing you all can work on and should work on, because your members of Congress need to know what you think. And they'll listen. They really do listen. I sat in those seats. I know how much influence people can have when they come and say, you know, this is really bothering me. Can't we change this? And you have no idea. I mean, it looks like it's impenetrable, but it's not. The system is open, especially if you go to the district offices or the state offices of senators. It's a hard question. I hope for the best, but we've got a ways to go. We really do. Both in the way we manage the resources and the way we manage our military. God bless this new president. He's got a rough row to hoe. And there's going to be lots of debate. You're very welcome. Thank you.